One morning, I woke up and decided that I needed more violence in my life. No more goody two-shoes, no more Mr. Nice Guy, just a tough thug doing whatever it takes to get what he wants. Now unfortunately, I'm about as tough as a toothpick and as violent as a flower, so I was limited in my options. Fortunately, the perfect game came around. So I made a ask, can Mafia, the old country, make me feel like a mobster? Hello everyone, my name's Vedi, a long-time League of Legends commentator, a sometimes actor and musician, and a full-time opinion haver. In this video, I hope to show you everything you need to know about Mafia, the old country. But before we get into that, I want to warn you that while I have tried to avoid spoilers, there may be some light ones. Either way, if you enjoy the video, be sure to leave a comment and consider subscribing, as it does help the channel out a lot. This was my first foray into the franchise, but the Mafia series itself goes as far back as 2002 and has multiple games featured under its umbrella, with the old country being their newest installment. Without any prior experience, I was excited to dip my toes into the world. It did leave me with a few mixed impressions, so let's get into them. Different games rely on different things to hook people in, and for this game, it is very much the story. It attempts to create a cinematic experience through the perspective of Enzo Favara, a man that was sold into the sulfur mines of San Celeste as a child and works to buy his freedom and make his own choices. Eventually, he forms a relationship with the Teresi's, a crime family that is well known and respected in the area. As you play, you experience more of what it's like to be a part of this family and the relationships that Enzo builds within it. A pretty straightforward premise that, with more depth, verges on spoiler territory. Overall, my experience with the story was mixed. It was a solid experience. There were moments of tension, enjoyable action, and some cool moments between characters. Unfortunately, I just didn't think it was enough. While there wasn't inherently anything wrong with the story, it just felt quite vanilla. Perhaps my expectations were too high, as this was my first taste of the Mafia series. But when I play a game that's whole premise revolves around the story, I want to be captivated as much as possible. I think it's fair to compare this game to my experiences of The Last of Us and Uncharted, given how similar they are in their designs. In both of those, I got to experience very much what I was expecting. On the one hand, I was fighting for survival while building an unexpected and deep connection to the characters, while the other took me on an adventure with parkour and puzzles to solve. Both stories kept me captivated throughout, but more importantly, they delivered on what I was expecting to happen. Coming into this game, I wanted the experience of being an old school mobster, and while there were definitely moments that gave me that, it largely left me unsatisfied. Now, the game also presents you with a variety of characters, with many fitting their roles effectively. The way Don Teresi is talked about and the portrayal of the character is well done, and I think the same is true for many of the characters around the Teresi family. However, I do find that throughout the story there isn't really that much depth. Like, the ways in which the characters develop throughout the story wasn't something that was conveyed particularly well, or just confused me. It felt like bits and pieces were missing to help me form a stronger connection to them, to make moments where they interact in the story more meaningful. I know my perspective is overly negative, but I still did enjoy the story for what it is. But I'd be lying if I didn't say there weren't parts of the game where I felt, am I near the end yet? Because of the variety of reasons listed. And for a game that's so centered on its story, this is the part that I rate the most harshly, given it is the pillar that this game is built around. I mentioned earlier that some of the best comparisons for this game are well-known titles such as The Last of Us and Uncharted, mainly because they're story-driven games with straightforward gameplay. Mafia: The Old Country follows that play pattern. It provides you with a semi-open world, with most of the game being divided into chapters that put you on a predetermined path, with opportunities throughout the game to explore the wider world. You will find yourself traveling across the beautifully designed world, either by horse or car, or because you crashed your car into a tree and you have to walk, which I would not recommend for any reason in particular. Missions are often divided into one of stealth missions, combat encounters, races, knife fights, fetch quests, or just talking to people in the world for narrative purposes. It follows a very similar formula for games in this genre. What I did like though is that it felt like you had to work a little harder in stealth missions in particular. Rather than immediately assassinating someone once you sneak up to them, as is quite common in games like this, they make you button mash square, and if you fail, you end up getting punished for it. It's not the greatest of innovation, but I did feel like it made me have to spend extra time taking someone out, which ran the risk of me being spotted. There are also large boxes, which I called mimics, where they could hide corpses. Fortunately, there was no limit to the number of corpses they could consume, allowing you to feed the hungry fellas to your heart's content. You can, however, still one-shot enemies with the blade, but it's only got a certain number of uses before it becomes dull and you need to resharpen it with a whetstone, with which you can only hold one at a time. Now, both of these things do seem like interesting limitations to factor in when navigating the stealth missions. However, the pathing of the vast majority of guards was so limited that the likelihood of you ever being spotted strangling Gus the guard was practically impossible, and because of this, the body hide mechanic felt pointless most of the time. Also, with the knife, you'd think that whetstones would be rare, and I did play on the hardest difficulty assuming resources would be more scarce. But stuff was practically everywhere, and anything that you couldn't find laying around, you could just loot off the corpses of Gus and the gang. The stealth missions overall were quite disappointing, as I felt that there was little to no challenge. The combat encounters, however, were my favourite part of the game. They're always the most unrealistic parts of these games, given the extreme body count that you amass, which would probably put you on the world's most wanted list, but they are still very fun. The game provides you with cover to hide behind, while streams of enemies come at you and a firefight ensues. At various points throughout the story, you're given access to the store, allowing you to buy different weapons. There's a bunch of different types that offer some variation in playstyles, from rifles to shotguns, pistols, and knives. The AI's accuracy was also pretty good in fairness, and I often found myself pinned down if I just recklessly ran at them. I also quite liked that they would actually push you to force you to move, or just put extra pressure on you, sometimes even throwing a grenade or two. On top of this, your accuracy wasn't super reliable, which I quite liked. While a headshot from any weapon would likely result in a kill, the accuracy of each weapon was quite varied, and you'd get different crosshairs depending on the weapon, along with sway, where your crosshair would just move around the screen, making it harder to reliably land headshots. The combat was nothing revolutionary, but it was fun, and was often my preferred approach to most situations. The boss encounters in this game were knife fights, where Enzo basically told people to 1v1 me bro. Early on, you get introduced to the mechanic that provides parrying, slashing, stabbing, dodging, and timing. I did think it was quite novel and enjoyable. Some fights were easier than others, and the different enemies employed a variety of tactics. Similarly to the other mechanics in this game though, it lacked depth. Once you had a grasp on the mechanics, the fights didn't really play out that differently. I abused the parry mechanic and found most of the fights quite straightforward. I think this was an area that had huge potential that left me wanting more. It was so close to being something really engaging that just fell short. I did mention it briefly earlier, but you do spend a lot of time traveling. Now, the game does provide you with the ability to skip directly to your destination when in the open world, which I did appreciate, even if I didn't use it very often. Traveling through the world often provided you with some form of exposition, either by supporting the lead narrative or maybe even filling in some of the blanks. It ranged pretty significantly. I quite liked it when games do this, because to me it's more interesting than just sitting around and talking to get the same information. However, this feels way worse when it happens anywhere that isn't on a horse or in a car. There's genuinely so much walking. It's unbelievable how often the game forces you to just slowly walk from point A to point B. And don't get me wrong, I understand why they do it, why it can make sense to do, but it just gets so tedious, and if you're at any point not invested in the story, it's just boring. It's part of the reason why I felt frustrated at times and why the pacing felt off. There was so much walking. It either needed to be a cutscene or they needed to find better ways to give this information because it was way too much for me. Overall, the gameplay does feel quite repetitive. While playing, I often said to myself it's fine for the gameplay to be like this because the focus is on the story, but then I decided that this shouldn't be the case. It's a game. Even if you're trying to tell a compelling story, developers should be using tools that are exclusive to gamers to better enrich the experience of their stories. I think it can be fine for some gameplay elements to take a back seat in order to prioritize the story, but that shouldn't justify game mechanics being repetitive throughout because it results in the player losing interest. It's still a game at the end of the day, and people play them for fun. This part is about other stuff that I thought about while playing the game that I thought you might be interested in. The game performs well. I played it on the PS5 and I didn't encounter any performance issues. I had one minor bug where I got stuck in a wall while trying to loot someone, but the game eventually fixed itself. The controls are also intuitive and run well. Often with games like this, I can find my character not doing what I wanted it to do, but navigating terrain, taking cover, and engaging with the world all ran smoothly. I will warn you that the cars are exceptionally difficult to operate and have a surprisingly high learning curve, but they do feel satisfying to drive once you get the hang of them. The learning process can be quite hilarious. I have mentioned it a few times, but they made the world look very pretty. It was a genuine pleasure to drive through the countryside of San Celeste, and there were a lot of visually appealing locations. It made me want to explore the world and just drive around. The downside to this is that the world is very empty. There aren't any side missions for you to do outside of trophy hunting or farming collectibles, which I thought was a real shame because I thought they did a good job. Speaking of, for any trophy or achievement hunters like myself, this game has a relatively easy plat trophy. You can replay the missions at any time, and the game does give you free roam access eventually. The collectibles were by far and away the most tedious part, but aside from that, it was a pretty fun game to complete all of the achievements on, and it took me a total of around 15 hours to do. The reason why the collectibles were so tedious was because you weren't allowed to put markers on the map, nor did the game give you a goddamn minimap. It's 2025, people. Can we please have a minimap? You have a speedometer there when I enter a car. You're able to add some little horse thingies when I get onto a horse. So why can't you add a minimap whenever I enter a vehicle? It's such an easy quality of life. If any developer is watching, just give us a minimap. Thanks. Overall, the game is solid. It doesn't inherently do anything wrong. It just fails to capitalize on what it does right. It's very close to being an amazing game, but for me, it just fell short in a number of areas. Maybe my expectations were too high, but it didn't quite give me the dark and gritty mobster feeling that I was hoping to experience, so I'm giving it 2 pineapples out of 5. I got it for £45 in the PlayStation Store, and while I wouldn't recommend grabbing it at that price, if you're looking for a fun and easygoing story that won't take up your whole life, consider grabbing this when it's on sale. If you've stuck around all the way to the end, let me know your thoughts on the game, or maybe even another game I should try that you'd like to hear me have opinions about. While you're down there, consider subscribing or leaving a like, as it does help the channel. In any case, I pray that the goddess of RNG blesses you all with good loot, good shit, and a good day. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.